Nathaniel Hayes had everything: money, power, influence, but the one thing he couldn't buy was a legacy. Desperate and determined, he found himself staring into the eyes of Marisol, a struggling artist on the verge of giving up hope. But this wasn't just a deal. It was the start of a journey that would change both their lives forever. Keep watching, because this story will take you places you never expected. Nathaniel Hayes lived in a world most people could only dream of, but for all his success, his sprawling mansion echoed with silence. No laughter, no children, no legacy. Nathaniel hated the thought that everything he had worked for, every grueling hour spent building his empire, might one day mean nothing. He was acutely aware of time slipping through his fingers, and the more he thought about it, the more the idea of an heir became an obsession. But Nathaniel wasn't the kind of man to wallow in emotions. He didn't believe in romantic notions or impulsive decisions. He was pragmatic, disciplined, and always solution-oriented. So when he decided he wanted a child, he approached it the only way he knew how, like a business deal. Marriage, too messy, too complicated. Love, that wasn't in his vocabulary. All he needed was someone willing to bear his child, someone who would deliver him an heir and then step away. It was simple, efficient. At least that's what he told himself. The search for someone to fulfill this unusual request wasn't as straightforward as he'd expected. He'd considered surrogacy, but it felt too detached. He wanted someone who could pass along the qualities he admired: resilience, strength, determination. It had to be someone unique. That's what led him to the edge of the city one cold afternoon, walking streets he'd never thought he'd set foot on. It was a stark world, lined with crumbling buildings and tired faces. The scent of stale food and gasoline clung to the air. He wasn't even sure why he was there until he saw her. She sat under a worn awning, sketching on a scrap of paper. Her clothes were layered but mismatched, her hair tucked under a knit cap that had seen better days. Her hands were red from the cold, but her grip on the pencil was steady. There was something about the way she sat there in the middle of chaos, focused entirely on her art. It was as if the rest of the world didn't exist. Nathaniel paused, watching her for a moment. She didn't notice him at first, her brow furrowed in concentration. He felt a strange pang of admiration for someone who could find focus amidst so much noise. Finally, he cleared his throat, and she looked up, startled. Her pencil paused mid-stroke as her dark eyes locked onto his. "Can I help you?" Nathaniel hesitated for a moment. The words he'd rehearsed felt clumsy now, foreign in the face of her scrutiny. "I have a proposition," he began, his voice careful. She raised an eyebrow, setting her sketch aside. "A proposition? You some kind of preacher or something?" "No, not quite," he said, unable to suppress a small smile at the irony. "I need someone to have my child," he continued, his words blunt now. "In exchange, I can offer you financial stability, a new life." Her reaction wasn't what he expected. She stared at him for a moment, then let out a bitter laugh. "Are you serious? What? You think I'm just gonna, pop out a kid for you and call it a day?" "It's not charity," he said quickly, sensing her rising anger. "It's a business arrangement. You'd be compensated, taken care of." She stood abruptly, brushing her hands against her threadbare coat. "You think you can just buy people?" she snapped. "That's what this is, isn't it? You've got money, and you think it solves everything." Nathaniel didn't flinch. He stayed calm. "I'm offering a solution to both our problems. I need an heir, and I can give you a way out of this." He gestured around them, not unkindly, to the streets that had clearly worn her down. "It's practical." "Practical?" she repeated, shaking her head. "You're insane." She grabbed her blanket and sketchbook, turning to leave. "Go back to whatever mansion you crawled out of." Nathaniel didn't follow her. He knew enough about people to recognize when to push and when to wait, so he simply said, "If you change your mind, meet me tomorrow, the diner on 8th Street. Marisol walked away, but his words stuck with her. That night, lying on her makeshift bed, she couldn't stop thinking about the absurdity of it all. Who did he think he was, swooping into her life like that? And yet, the offer gnawed at her. It was offensive, but it was also a way out, a chance to start over. The next morning, she found herself standing outside the diner he'd mentioned. She hated herself a little for even considering it, but she couldn't ignore the voice in the back of her head, whispering that this might be her only chance. Inside, Nathaniel was sitting in a booth, his back straight, his shoulders rigid. When he saw her walk in, his expression flickered with something like surprise before settling back into that same composed calm. "All right," she said, sliding into the seat across from him. "Let's hear the details." For the next hour, they talked. Nathaniel explained the arrangement, what she'd receive, what he expected. Marisol fired questions at him, her skepticism sharp, trying to find the catch. But his answers stayed consistent, logical. By the time their conversation ended, her head was spinning. "I'll do it," she said finally, the words surprising even herself. The contract Nathaniel handed Marisol was not just thorough, it was borderline terrifying. It wasn't a casual 2-page agreement you'd skim over with coffee in one hand and a pen in the other. No, this thing was a beast, a binder, thick and ominous, full of legal jargon that seemed designed to make her feel small and powerless. The first time she flipped through it, her eyebrows climbed higher and higher with every clause. "Really?" she muttered loud, reading a section titled Prohibited Activities. "No rock climbing, skydiving, or horseback riding? You think I was planning to take up bungee jumping while pregnant?" Nathaniel, sitting across the room with his usual calm demeanor, didn't flinch. "It's a precaution." "For what? The extremely unlikely chance I suddenly develop a death wish?" He glanced up from his phone. "Do you have one?" Marisol rolled her eyes, but she couldn't suppress the smile tugging at her lips. "Guess we'll find out." The contract covered everything. She was to live in the apartment he provided, eat only approved meals, which thankfully came from a chef and not some horrifying diet plan, and follow all medical recommendations to the letter. Any hobbies or activities that could result in even the slightest injury were strictly forbidden. She was also required to notify him immediately of any concerns, no matter how minor. "You want a daily report on my health, too?" she teased. "That would be helpful," he replied, without missing a beat. She sighed and flipped to the next section, compensation. This part was impossible to ignore. The payout was generous, staggeringly so, enough to start over somewhere warm, somewhere far away from the cold streets she'd known for so long, enough to make her hesitate, pen in hand, as she stared at the signature line. The terms were explicit. The child would be his, legally and entirely. No further involvement from her unless both parties agreed otherwise. Everything about it felt clinical, transactional, like buying a house or negotiating a corporate merger. But what choice did she have? The memory of her nights on the street, of gnawing hunger and sleepless fear, loomed large in her mind. With a resigned breath, she signed it. "Well, that's done," pushing the document across the table. "Guess I'm officially part of your master plan now." Nathaniel glanced at her. "You won't regret it?" "I'm holding you to that," she said, jabbing her finger in his direction. As for the pregnancy itself, the process was as unromantic as the contract had been. They agreed on in vitro fertilization, a method Nathaniel described as efficient, which quickly became Marisol's least favorite word in the English language. The clinic was state-of-the-art, full of gleaming equipment and impeccably dressed staff who spoke in hushed tones, as though any loud noise might disrupt the delicate science at work. The doctor explained the procedure with all the warmth of an instructional video, while Nathaniel stood off to the side, his hands clasped behind his back. Marisol watched him out of the corner of her eye. "So, are you going to look this uncomfortable the whole time, or is that just your resting face?" she asked, unable to resist poking at him. He turned to her. "I'm not uncomfortable." "Uh-huh," she said, smirking. "Sure, Mr. Resting Face of Stone." The procedure itself was quick and clinical. Marisol lay on the exam table, staring at the ceiling, while the doctor and nurses worked with quiet precision. After it was over, she sat up and stretched, wincing slightly. "Well, that wasn't as bad as I thought it'd be." "Weird, but not bad." Nathaniel stayed nearby, but didn't speak. "Was it weird for you?" she asked, breaking the silence. He blinked, clearly caught off guard by the question. "What do you mean?" "Having your whole legacy start like that," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the sterile equipment. Nathaniel paused, considering her words. Then he shrugged, his answer as predictable as ever. "It's efficient," Marisol snorted. "Of course it is. Why would I expect you to say anything else?" As clinical as the day had been, Marisol couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just happened. Not just the science of the pregnancy, but the beginning of something else entirely. She couldn't put her finger on it, but it left her both amused and uneasy. The first few weeks passed uneventfully, at least on the surface, but to Marisol, every moment felt like an adjustment, a small battle to fit into a world she'd never thought she'd inhabit. The sleek apartment Nathaniel had arranged for her was so polished it felt like it should have been roped off in a museum. Her tattered duffel bag, a relic of her life on the streets, looked almost comically out of place, sitting on the gleaming hardwood floor. When she first walked in, she stood in the middle of the living room, turning in a slow circle. The furniture looked more expensive than anything she'd ever owned. Her eyes drifted up to the high ceilings, then back down to the massive window that offered a panoramic view of the city. Well, she muttered to herself, shifting awkwardly, this is something. The kitchen was pristine, the fridge practically glowing when she opened it. Rows of fresh vegetables, neatly packaged meats, and artisanal cheeses stared back at her. The bathroom was next. She turned on the taps in the bathtub, watching in awe as steam began to rise. She wasn't used to showers that stayed hot for longer than 2 minutes, much less a tub that could fill to the brim. When she finally sank into the water, she let out a groan of relief. Don't get used to it, she told herself, though the warmth of the bath made it hard to take her own advice. The first night was the hardest. Marisol sat on the edge of the massive bed, staring at the lavender sheets like they were a trap. The mattress looked impossibly soft, pillows plump and inviting. Slowly she lay down, stretching out and letting herself sink into the comfort. "Oh no," she whispered, her voice almost trembling. "This is dangerous." The silence was unnerving. For years she'd slept with one ear open, ready to wake at the slightest sound. Here there were no shouting neighbors, no rattling pipes, no distant sirens to keep her grounded. It was too quiet, too peaceful, and the overwhelming strangeness of it all hit her in waves. Before she knew it, tears were streaming down her face. They weren't loud or dramatic, just a steady release of emotions she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. Relief, exhaustion, maybe even grief for the years she'd spent without this kind of comfort. The next morning, the sunlight streaming through the window woke her earlier than she'd planned. She blinked, momentarily disoriented, before remembering where she was. Slowly, she made her way to the kitchen, drawn by the faint hum of the coffee machine Nathaniel had insisted on installing. She wasn't sure how to use it, so she settled for toast and scrambled eggs. It had been years since she'd made a meal like this, something warm, something fresh. The first bite of eggs made her pause, her fork hovering mid-air as the taste spread through her. For so long, food had been fuel, something to keep her going, rarely something to enjoy. Now, with her stomach full for the first time in ages, she felt a strange kind of guilt. "Don't get too comfortable," she whispered to herself, though the second slice of toast she made suggested otherwise. Nathaniel's visit started the next week. He was as stiff and awkward as Marisol had expected. He always knocked exactly 3 times, waited for her to answer, and then stepped inside as though he was afraid to stay too long. He'd sit in the same chair by the window, his posture ramrod straight, and glance around the apartment like he was checking for imperfections. "How's the baby?" His tone as neutral as a weather report. "Fine," she'd reply, wondering what he expected her to say. "Thriving, kicking, learning advanced calculus." Sometimes he'd bring papers for her to sign, medical forms, nutrition plans, reports from her doctor. He'd explain them in clipped professional tones, but Marisol couldn't help feeling like a product being monitored. One evening, after a particularly awkward visit, she snapped. "Do you even care?" she blurted out, crossing her arms. Nathaniel froze mid-step, turning back to her with a frown. "What are you talking about?" "This whole thing," she said, gesturing toward her stomach. "You treat it like a business deal, like I'm some employee checking in with my manager. Do you even care about any of this?" He looked genuinely taken aback, his lips parting as though to argue, but no words came out. "Of course I care. That's why I'm here." "Being here isn't the same as being present, Nathaniel," she shot back. For a moment, his expression softened, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't noticed before. "I'll try," he said simply, and then he left. One evening, after a particularly long day, he stopped by unannounced. Marisol didn't notice him at first. She was hunched over the coffee table, her brow furrowed in concentration as her pencil moved across a pad of paper. Her hair fell loosely around her face, and she bit her lip as she worked, utterly absorbed in what she was doing. "What are you doing?" Nathaniel asked, his voice breaking the silence. She jumped, the pencil halting mid-stroke. "You scared me," she said, pressing a hand to her chest. "It's just drawing." He stepped closer, leaning over to see the page. It was a sketch of the city skyline, rough but striking in its detail. Nathaniel studied it for a moment. "You're good," he said, a note of genuine surprise in his voice. She shrugged, her fingers tightening around the pencil. "I used to paint, a long time ago." "Why'd you stop?" he asked, his tone curious but careful. She set the sketchbook down, her fingers tracing the edge of the page. "You know, I used to have a studio," smiling faintly at the memory. "Nothing fancy. just a tiny space in the corner of this old creaky building. The windows leaked when it rained, and in the winter I had to keep my coat on because it was so cold. But it was mine, my little corner of the world. What happened? He asked, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. Life, she said simply. I was doing okay for a while, selling paintings, working odd jobs to keep things going, but then my mom got sick, and I couldn't afford to keep the studio and pay for her care. I thought I'd just take a break, pause for a bit and come back to it later. But she didn't get better, Marisol said, her voice tight. And after she passed, it was like the floor just fell out from under me. I lost the apartment, the studio, everything. And once you're on the street, it's hard to climb back out. People stop seeing you. You stop seeing yourself. Her hands gripped the sketchbook a little tighter, and she shook her head as though to shake off the weight of her words. Anyway, she said, forcing a lighter tone, that's why this feels like someone else's life, because it kind of is. Nathaniel didn't respond right away. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, but something in his eyes had softened. Maybe it doesn't have to be. Marisol blinked, surprised. What do you mean? I mean, you're here now. You're not on the street anymore. Maybe it's not about going back to what you had. Maybe it's about starting something new. For a moment, she stared at him, unsure of how to respond. Starting over, huh? A wry smile tugging at her lips. Nathaniel gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. It's just a thought. Look at you, getting all philosophical, she teased, though her voice was softer now. It wasn't until the 4th month that things began to shift in a way neither of them could ignore. Marisol's stomach had started to round noticeably, a physical reminder that the abstract notion of their arrangement was becoming something real, something alive. She caught herself staring at her reflection in the mirror more often, her hand unconsciously resting on the curve of her belly as though trying to make peace with the life growing inside her. One evening, Nathaniel arrived at the apartment carrying a bag of groceries. He didn't knock this time, having gotten used to letting himself in when she was expecting him. Marisol was sitting on the couch, sketching as usual. Careful, she said, setting her pencil down. You're starting to act like you live here. Nathaniel quirked a brow. If I did, this place would look much tidier. She rolled her eyes but smiled. All right, let's see what you've got. She opened the bag and peered inside. More kale? It's good for you. Yeah, she muttered, pulling out a box of pasta. Oh, look, real food, that's a step up. And chocolate? She asked, raising her brows hopefully as she sifted through the bag. Nathaniel hesitated, glancing away. I might have forgotten that, Marisol smirked, shaking her head. You're lucky I'm easy to bribe, but seriously, next time, chocolate is non-negotiable. I'll make a note. She leaned against the counter, watching him unpack the rest of the groceries. So, she said, crossing her arms, is this your way of saying you're staying for dinner? Nathaniel paused, a can of tomatoes in his hand, and looked at her. I suppose I could stay, he said slowly, as if testing out the idea. Oh, come on, she teased. You've been doing the stoic drive-by visit thing for weeks now. Might as well hang out for a bit. I promise not to feed you, Kale. His lips twitched again, and this time he didn't bother hiding the small smile. All right, said. What's on the menu, then? An hour later, they sat at the small dining table, plates of spaghetti in front of them. Marisol had taken over the cooking, shooing Nathaniel out of the kitchen. When it became clear, he was more of a grocery delivery guy than an actual chef. You really don't cook much, do you? She asked as she twirled her fork. I'm efficient, he replied, his favorite word slipping out again. She groaned dramatically. Efficient is not a personality trait, Nathaniel. You should try being fun once in a while. He gave her a deadpan look. I'm plenty fun, Marisol snorted. Oh, sure. You're a regular stand-up comedian. Nathaniel didn't respond immediately, but after a moment he said, I could tell you a joke. Her eyes widened. Is this happening? Is Nathaniel Hayes about to tell a joke? Stop the presses. He straightened in his chair, his expression so serious it was almost comical. Why don't skeletons fight each other? Marisol blinked. I don't know. Why? Because they don't have the guts. There was a beat of silence before Marisol burst out laughing, nearly choking on her pasta. Oh, my God, she wheezed, clutching her stomach. That was awful, so awful. I can't believe you actually told that. Nathaniel's lips twitched into a full smile now, and for a moment the weight between them felt lighter, the strangeness of their arrangement fading into the background. After dinner, they lingered in the living room. Marisol sat cross-legged on the couch, flipping through her sketchbook, while Nathaniel leaned against the armrest, a cup of coffee in his hand. You're not bad at this whole hanging out thing, she said without looking up. Don't get used to it, he replied, though though his tone was more playful than stern. She glanced at him. "You say that, but I think you're starting to like me." "Let's not get carried away," he said, though the way his gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary told a different story. The walls they'd built around themselves were still high, but there were cracks now, cracks that let in a little light and the possibility of something more. During a routine checkup, Marisol lay on the examination table, the cool gel on her stomach a mild discomfort compared to the nerves buzzing in her chest. The ultrasound technician moved the wand across her belly, her brow furrowing slightly before she exchanged a look with the doctor. "What is it?" Marisol asked, her voice sharp with alarm. The doctor turned the screen toward her and Nathaniel. "You're carrying twins," the doctor said, her tone calm but tinged with seriousness. "Twins?" Marisol repeated, the word barely registering. Nathaniel's reaction was delayed, as though his mind was working overtime to process the information. "Are they healthy?" The doctor nodded, but didn't smile. "So far, everything looks good, but carrying twins comes with increased risks, especially as the pregnancy progresses. Marisol, your body will be under significant strain and will need to monitor you closely for complications. Early delivery is a strong possibility." Marisol's heart sank as the gravity of the situation settled over the room. She glanced at Nathaniel, his face pale and unreadable. "Twins," she whispered again, her hand instinctively resting on her stomach. The news shifted everything. What had once been an unusual arrangement, complicated but manageable, now felt precarious, like a tightrope walk over a canyon. Each passing week brought more tension, more uncertainty. Nathaniel became a constant presence, attending every appointment, every consultation. Gone was the composed, distant man Marisol had met months ago. In his place was someone who paced hospital waiting rooms, his phone forgotten in his pocket, his worry etched into every line of his face. At one appointment, the doctor reviewed Marisol's charts, her expression grave. "We need to talk about delivery options," she said. "Given the strain on your body, carrying to full term is unlikely. We'll monitor closely, but an early delivery may be necessary to ensure the safety of both the babies and you." Nathaniel leaned forward in his chair, his elbows resting on his knees. "How early are we talking?" His tone sharper than intended. 34 weeks, maybe earlier," the doctor replied. "It depends on how things progress." Marisol felt the weight of the words settle in her chest. "What happens if something goes wrong?" she asked quietly. The doctor hesitated, her professionalism faltering for just a moment. "If complications arise, there may be decisions to make. It's not something we can predict, but you should both prepare yourselves." That night, Nathaniel stayed at the hospital longer than usual. Marisol sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped over her stomach, her mind racing. The quiet hum of the machines was the only sound in the room until she broke the silence. "If it comes down to it," she said, her voice low but steady, "save them." Nathaniel, who had been staring out the window, turned sharply. "Don't say that. You have to promise me," she insisted, her eyes locking onto his. They were wet but unwavering, filled with a determination that made her seem unshakable despite her vulnerability. "They deserve a chance." Nathaniel stepped closer, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "And what about you? You think I can just stand there and let you—" His voice broke, the words catching in his throat. She reached for his hand, her touch gentle but firm. "Nathaniel, listen to me. I've lived through worse than this. If something happens, those babies, your babies, deserve to live. Promise me." "I can't lose you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. For the first time, his stoic mask cracked completely. His eyes shone, his usually steady breathing uneven. Marisol smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "You're not losing me," she said softly. "Not really. I'll be with them, always." He knelt beside her, his hand still in hers, and for a long time, they stayed that way, two people caught in the grip of a moment far bigger than themselves. As the days went on, the tension only grew. Marisol's body struggled to keep up with the demands of the pregnancy. She tired easily, her once light humor giving way to quiet determination. Nathaniel rarely left her side, though he tried to hide how much the situation weighed on him. One night, after she'd fallen asleep, he sat in the chair by the window, staring out at the city lights. His mind churned with thoughts of what-ifs and worst-case scenarios. He thought about his father's voice, the lessons drilled into him about control and responsibility. None of it had prepared him for this, for the helplessness that came with loving something so much it terrified him. He glanced back at Marisol, her hand resting protectively over her stomach, even in sleep. "I'll do right by you," he whispered to the quiet room. by all of you. The day of delivery came sooner than expected. A complication during a routine checkup sent alarms through the medical team, and within hours, Marisol was prepped for an emergency C-section. Nathaniel paced the hallway outside the operating room, his usually steady demeanor replaced by raw panic. The minutes dragged like hours, each one stretching unbearably as he waited for news. When the doctor finally emerged, her scrubs speckled with blood, Nathaniel rushed to her. "The twins are stable," she said, her voice calm but tired. "Marisol's resting, but it was close, too close." Nathaniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Relief and guilt tangled in his chest as he nodded. "Can I see her?" "Soon," the doctor said. "She's a fighter, Mr. Hayes. You're lucky." He didn't feel lucky, not yet. But when he finally saw Marisol, pale and exhausted but alive, holding two impossibly small bundles in her arms, something inside him shifted. She looked up at him, her smile weak but genuine. "Meet your legacy," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathaniel's throat tightened as he stepped closer, his hands trembling as he reached for one of the babies. As he cradled the tiny life in his arms, he felt the enormity of what had happened, of what he'd almost lost. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to truly care for someone beyond himself, and he knew, without a doubt, that he would spend the rest of his life proving himself worthy of what they'd all survived together. As the weeks passed, Marisol grew stronger, and the twins thrived under her care. Nathaniel visited often, though their interactions had shifted. The formality that once defined their relationship had faded, replaced by something quieter, something unspoken. Yet Marisol couldn't ignore the looming reality their arrangement was nearing its end. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the windows, Marisol sat on the couch with the twins nestled in her arms. Nathaniel stood by the window, his hands in his pockets, gazing out at the city below. The silence between them was heavy, neither wanting to break it. "Nathaniel," Marisol began, her voice steady but soft. He turned, his eyes meeting hers. "Yes?" "It's time," she said, her words deliberate. "The contract, it's over. I should leave." For a moment he didn't respond. Then he stepped closer, his hands falling to his sides. "You want to leave?" "It's not about what I want," she said, her gaze dropping to the twins. "This was always the deal. I carry the babies and then I go. That's what we agreed on." "That was before," he said finally, his voice quieter than she expected. "Before what?" "Before all of this," he said, gesturing to the room, the twins, the life they'd somehow built together. "Before I knew you." Marisol blinked, her throat tightening. "Nathaniel, this isn't what we planned." "No," he admitted, stepping even closer, his voice growing firmer. "But plans change, people change. I've changed, Marisol, and I know this wasn't supposed to be anything more than a transaction, but it is, at least for me." She stared at him, her breath catching in her chest. "I don't want you to go," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "Not you, not them. We've built something here. It's not perfect, and God knows I've made mistakes, but I want to try. I want us to try." Marisol's lips parted, but no words came out. She looked down at the twins, their tiny faces so peaceful, then back at Nathaniel, who looked more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. "I'm not asking for an answer right now," he said, his tone softening. "But think about it. Stay here, with me, with them. Let's build something, together." Her eyes welled with tears, but she wiped them away quickly, laughing softly. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not," he said with a faint smile, "but it's worth it." Marisol looked at him for a long time, her heart and mind warring with each other. She'd spent so much of her life fighting to survive, to stand on her own. The thought of staying, of building a life with someone like Nathaniel, terrified her, but it also gave her hope. Finally, she nodded, her voice trembling as she said, "Okay, let's try." Nathaniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his shoulders relaxing. "We'll figure it out," he said. Marisol smiled, looking down at the twins once more. "Yeah," she murmured, "we will." For the first time in years, the future didn't seem like something to fear. Together they would face it one day at a time.